My name is McDonagh. I was born in Ireland in the 1940s. I was ordained 47 years ago at this time, and I went to the Philippines in 1969, and I worked there in a parish for a number of years. I was particularly interested, because of the theological degree, in the whole area of enculturation. That the gospel is meant to speak to the imagination, to capture the imagination of people through their culture, through the symbols that mean something to them. So in 1972, I found myself taking a train I was just writing an article on it the other day, from New York to Washington to study anthropology at Catholic University and linguistics at Georgetown. So I stayed there until 1975, when I went back to the Philippines. And one of the jobs I had there, we Columbans, who are Irish, and the Columban Seminary here in Boston, in Milton, right through from the 1940s onwards, we were involved in the challenges of mission, and particularly justice, peace, but also interreligious dialogue, because one of the great issues of the 20th century, and now we know the 21st century, is how Christianity and Islam will live together in peace and recognize each other's great strengths. So we were involved in Christian-Muslim dialogue there right back in the 1970s. Luckily, about 1977, one of my students, who eventually became a Carmelite nun, was doing a study, an ethnography of a tribal group in the Philippines, who were neither Christian nor Muslim, the Tiboli, and I said I'd go down and help her with the linguistics of it. And that decision, like very often things happen, changed my life. Because I saw what happened to the tropical rainforest. I saw its impact on the people. I saw the kind of the 50% infant mortality. So I saw the knock-on effect of destroying one's environment. And at that stage, nothing was being written in the Catholic Church. There was nothing in Vatican II. A wonderful 4 years from 1962 to 66, nothing on the environment. So that's the world. That was my big conversion in 1978. And basically since then I've been trying to promote this as the central concern of religion in the 20th and 21st century. Not a tangential one, the central. And it won't be waiting around for us, because that's the awful issue with the environment. Even if we decide to stick our heads in the sand and say nothing is happening, things are happening and will happen, as we will see in climate change. So this is an extraordinary document. Laudato Si. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, would I expect to see it in my lifetime, I would have said no. And as I will say this morning, we have gone from just being above kindergarten as a church to almost doing a PhD with this wonderful, wonderful document. So let's start with it. It deals with environmental issues, the first real encyclical to deal with them in terms of data. Pope Paul VI dealt with some of them in the 1960s. Pope John Paul II did also, and Pope Benedict in Caritas and Veritas. But they never mentioned data. They never mentioned what's happening to, for example, in climate change. Why is the climate changing? He does. He mentions data all the time, and particularly in areas like biodiversity. But it's also, for me, it's an extraordinary evangelical document. If you want to ask me, I go and get my copy of it, because here is my... If you wanted to ask me, could I recommend for you, if someone asks you, could you give me one book that would help me to live as a Christian in the 21st century? I'd give them this for one hand, and I'd give them the Bible for the other. I said, let's work it out between you. I really mean that. But I will also be saying to you, we will have to take it very seriously. And so it's not just ecological issues, it's not just economic issues, it's the issue of the gospel as good news. So he starts with an extraordinary statement from Saint Francis, not Pope Francis, in his time. He spoke Umbrian, Proto-Italian, and so he started with the Canticle of Creatures. Now, we have to remember, many of you would have seen Zeffirelli's film in the 1970s about St. Francis, that he was dancing around the hills of Umbria. He wasn't. He had been fired as minister of the Franciscans. He had lost his job. He was to have his eyes cauterized within a month. And he was totally upset that each night rodents were running over him. So that's not the Zapparelli, that's not the Francis running around the hills of Umbria up in Assisi. So it's this extraordinary, and it is an extraordinary thing for the Christian movement that he said that the metaphor that's most helpful in talking about the rest of creation are family metaphors. Brother, sister, mother. That is unthinkable, given Plato from the Greek world and given Augustine from the Christian world in the 5th century. We did not like creation, and we certainly didn't like the bodies of women. Read Ambrose on it, read particularly Jerome. So this is an extraordinary text from Francis. Now it's extraordinary culturally too, because if Francis hadn't written in Umbrian, Dante would not have written the Commedia 100 years later. So it's actually very important for European literature, both Italian and the other languages of. So, for me, it's the most important document to come from Rome in 100 years, since Catholic social teaching began in 1891 with Pope, with Miracle of Ireland from Leo the 13th, called New Things. Now, normally encyclicals, the Greek word is to send around letters. Encyclicals are sent to bishops, patriarchs, cardinals, now, what have you. This one is sent to everyone. It's addressed to every person on the planet. And by the way, the subtitle is Common Home. It's Domus Communis in Latin. So that's our common home of people. Wrong. That's the common home of every creature on the planet. So now we have the first place we put our foot on the brake, because in Catholic social teaching we used to say the goods of this world and all the realities are meant for all the peoples of this world. That's true, but only half true. They're meant for all the creatures of this world. And here we go into, and you're surrounded here by wonderful universities, Harvard and all of those. We do not have a clue. We have no idea how many creatures live on the planet, how many species live on the planet with us. If you go to London, you go to the gardens there, you will find material on 2 million species. Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? We don't know. So that is certainly something for the humankind at this level, the level of our intellectual understanding, that the first thing we should know is every creature living on the planet with us. We don't. So, he's wanting us to get. Now, he talked about this wonderful mother and sister that creation is, that Francis saw even through his cauterized eyes. But Francis Pope gets right to the heart of it. In number 4, he said, due to the ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and becoming, in turn, a victim of this degradation. So here we have, for the first time ever from a Pope, a statement about the magnitude of the ecological issue. The ecological issue is not just something happening where we've had a spill or something. It has affected every single aspect of planet Earth. From the toxification of our world, right through the changing of the chemistry of our air and climate change, right through, as we will see, the destruction of biodiversity. So this is one of enormous magnitude and urgency. We could put off dealing with Christology for 100 years, because we've done a lot of work on it in the last 2,000 years. We can't put off dealing with the environment. If we do, your grandchildren and grandnieces and nephews will live in the world that you have left to them. Now this is, people said, yes, I was involved, I made quite a number of I left around Rome for many, many talks, about 35,000 words. But I would never write something like this. And you just read it. The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Now, would your governor write it? Would your mayor write it? Would the United Nations write it? I don't think they would. And when people said, did Francis write this? I said, absolutely. Look at the starting language he uses. Now, he's like myself. He's older than I by 9 years. He and all of us who are that age remember the plastic reality of our planet. I remember the beginning of plastic. Now we have destroyed the earth with plastic all over, and particularly in the mid-Atlantic and the mid-Pacific. Francis reminds us something, that our responsibility within creation and our duty towards nature and the creation are an essential part of our faith. Now again, I just say, here again we put our foot on the brake, because it's not an essential part of our faith. Just listen to what we read there 2 days ago in Mark's Gospel. Basically, he talks about the thou shalt love the Lord thy God with your whole heart and soul and mind, and your neighbour as yourself. That's what we believe. That's what we've acted on. Now we're being asked to believe something quite specifically different. That our relationship with the natural world, that's the trees out there, that's the grass out there, which is terribly essential to us. The chlorophyll in the grass means we can live. And every other species, the birds, all of the insects, they are part of species living with us. And if we want to have an ecological spirituality, we better get to know them and know what they do and know their part in the world in which we share. So, the wonderful thing about Francis on this is the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragile planet. More so than any pope has ever. And I think it becomes because he was Archbishop for 25 years in Buenos Aires. There's over 300,000 poor people in Buenos Aires. And Francis had the ability, and did it many, many times, to go out, as I did in the Philippines, and sit with people. And not tell them why they're poor, but ask them, what's your situation? And that's what Francis did with these people. So, all through this encyclica, he's absolutely clear on the relationship, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor together. And he makes a point that I think is important. The deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness and compassion and concern for our fellow human beings. I mean, I've been involved in the environmental movement for almost 40 years. There's a group within that almost looks on us humans as a cancer on the biosphere because of what we have done. And in many ways you can understand that and say, well, if we got rid of humans, the planet would do real well. Francis, nor I, we don't share that view. Because he's making the point, tenderness and compassion for all creatures, and particularly for humankind. And he's making, this is the kind of commitment we need, a sincere love for our fellow human beings as a commitment to resolving their problems. As we will see, he quotes all over the place. He quotes bishops, and he quotes the New Zealand bishops. And that's a challenge to people like ourselves from Europe and from North America. That 20% of the world's population use up 80% of the world's resources. Now, that's something we've got to begin to take on board. Can that continue in a sustainable way? If we had 5 worlds, it could. But as far as I know from astronomers, we only have 1 world. And the nearest other system to us is literally millions or billions of miles away. So this document now has become basically the social teachings of the Church on the environment. As we will see before this, in the compendium of the social teaching of the Church, we only have 15 pages. Everything in that is here, and it's transformed and made extraordinary. So, Laudato Si goes beyond anything before in Catholic social teaching. Rerum Novarum on the workers and on a real challenge to liberal capitalism. Pacem in Terris, a challenge to peace when we were armed with nuclear weapons. Progressio Populorum, 1967, on the true progress of people, not just economic progress. You can have economic progress in a country and just the very small 1% benefiting from it. I always think of when I have never been invited to Davos, by the way, and I'm not too sure I will be. But for the last 5 years, Oxfam Britain has a critique. 5 years ago, the critique was that 380 corporations actually owned the equivalent of what the lower 50% of humanity, that's 3.5 billion people own. That was 5 years ago. This year in Davos, they said it's now reduced to 63. 63 very rich people own exactly what 3.5 billion people own. So they said we could put them all in one bus. So that's how economic development can work, but that's not how it should work. And that's why we need a moral understanding. So in this encyclical, it's addressed to all creation. Now he brings up forward a very important insight from Pope John Paul II. And it is that to address these issues, we will need profound changes in lifestyle, modes of production and consumption, and the structures of power. So I'll just go through those very quickly. All of us are heirs to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. It was a wonderful reality. We have gone from, just very briefly, there was an Irish archbishop, he was Church of Ireland, a man called James Ussher, very bright. In 1650, he got his pencil out and he said, how old is our planet? And he added up, Adam was so old, and he came down. The planet began on the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. Now everyone laughs at that. Now, he was actually a very bright man. The generation after him, Isaac Newton, he came up with about 2 years later. So now we know that this planet began 4.8 billion years ago. We know that our universe system began 13.7 billion years ago. Before we got a telescope and could look at the stars meaningfully, Tycho Brahe was probably the last of the astronomers to look with his naked eyes. And he spent 30 years at it and counting out every single star in the sky. And he thought that there was 817, or is it 818? We know there are 400 billion stars in our, and there's a billion of our galaxies. So we are, that's the world we're, and the Industrial Revolution happened after that. So we believe, actually, that some technology is going to solve our issue of climate change, for example, or biodiversity. Pope John Paul II is saying, no, there have to be major changes in our lifestyle. So that's something, if you were discussing this, what kind of changes are we talking about? Then he goes on very directly to the models of production. And Pope Francis talks about this. He said, look at nature. It's cyclic. What's effluent from one becomes food for another. And that's the cyclic nature of the way of creation and sustainability. But look what we humans do. We go to our mines or petrochemicals, we look for them. In the process, we pollute the earth. Then we run it through our industrial systems. We're not even clear on those. There's a guy called Donald Trump who would like to get rid of the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Imagine that, what you would do with your processes. And then he hands them over, we hand it over to the consumer. And the consumer uses it for 2 years or 4 years. How old is your phone? Oh, it's 3 years. So, and we throw it away into the rubbish heap, also polluting. So those are the processes of production and consumption which just cannot continue. They cannot be sustainable. And then the structures, economic and political structures that make sustainability possible. It's a very short statement, but it's very, very profound. Laudato Si does two things. It focuses on the magnitude of the ecological destruction and the urgency with which it must be faced. That's it. There's no one say, well, it's bad, but we can put it off until we're finished with, until unemployment is down to 2%, until housing. You can't. We have learned that in the last 100 years. As I say, this is an extraordinary document for the Catholic Church. The World Council of Churches had worked hugely in the 1970s and 80s. I worked with them myself in the 80s and 90s. The Catholic Church hadn't. In actual fact, the social the Compendium of Social Teaching of the Church was published only in 2004 and has no sense of the ecological issue at all. For example, chapter 10 is on the environment. It is 15 pages. Now that's for 3.8 billion years of God's life creativity on the planet. The section on work, chapter 6, is 26 pages. And worse still, the climate change, a half a paragraph. You'd read it through without actually saying, well, that's climate change looked after. Destruction of biodiversity, we are extinguishing 100,000 species a year, half a paragraph. And biotechnology, now this really blows my mind. Biotechnology, this is the corporations of the world. Syngenta, 9 paragraphs. Imagine, 9 paragraphs. So that's where we've come from. The other thing that this Pope has done, which no Pope in recent times has done, is he actually quotes bishops. He trusts bishops. There are 17 bishops' conferences published in this particular document. As I say, normally, when you're writing an encyclical before, you quoted the scriptures, you quoted the fathers of the church, you didn't quote the mothers of the church. We haven't got around to that yet. Maybe, I think we should. You quote the schoolmen, maybe Aquinas, maybe Bonaventure, you quote modern popes, and you quote yourself. This man quotes all over the place, telling us that the church is local, and particularly environments is local. There was a guy here when I was in Washington, he was your representative, Tip O'Neill. Tip used to say, all politics is local. And he had a good reason for saying that, because Mr. Reagan was president, well, the first bit after he was president. The reality is, all politics might be local. All environments are local. There is no other environment like this anywhere on the planet. So, then he goes even way beyond that. Who is the central feature he personally introduces in the beginning of this encyclical? It's the Patriarch Bartholomew of the Greek Church. He's the Patriarch of Constantinople. Did wonderful work since he was elected in 1991, particularly on water. He started in 1994, bringing a ship onto the Black Sea with scientists, with politicians, economists, Christians, theologians. Why have we destroyed this? And of course, we destroyed it because of the policies of the USSR, their agricultural policies for 55 years before that. Most of it was dead, as the area south of the Mississippi in the Caribbean is dead in this country. Question: why do we do it? Why were we not aware when it was happening? And what are we going to do about it now? He has gone through many of the bodies of the world, water bodies, including the Mississippi, over the years. So he's wonderfully sensitive to this whole area. And so the moral responsibility comes straight from him, and he talks about it. For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation. For human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forest, or destroying its wetlands. Just about everything, yeah. And then he includes, for human beings to contaminate the earth's water, its land, its air, its life. So that's the Patriarch saying, these are things. Now what's he going to say next? Maybe you shouldn't do that, or please don't do it, or... He doesn't. He says something extraordinarily profound. These are sins. Now, the problem here is, again, we have to put our foot down on the brake. None of us here believe that. It's not part of loving God and loving your neighbour. But he's saying these are sins. And Francis, in the next line, repeats that these are sins. So we have a job as Christians. And it's not just Catholics. I mean, your Episcopal Church is dealing with this in my own country. The Anglican Church is actually doing more, in many ways more with Laudato Si than the Catholic churches. We have to develop in our moral imagination that these are sins, that these areas of our relationship with God, our relationship with other human beings, and our relationship with the earth are intertwined, as we will see in number 67. Now that's going to take a really strong catechesis to change the way we actually. Now, younger people are more sensitive to this because in their schooling, in their biology classes, in the way they look at the natural world, they're more open to it. But that's the first thing we have to. So, He also has taken on board this September 1 as a day when everyone prays for creation. I would hope we would be looking in the Catholic Church, in many churches around the world, including the Catholic Church in the Philippines. They have introduced this notion of season of creation. It's September, whether it's 4 Sundays or 5 Sundays. And you will deal, for example, one Sunday with the oceans, another Sunday with water, another Sunday with soils, whatever it is. All your texts, your sermons, your prayers of it are all about them. And I think that's the kind of thing we need. And maybe we should be talking to our Archbishop here and other bishops to bring in this whole notion of the seasons of creation as part of a catechesis. So he talks about every Christian tradition has something to offer for overcoming the ecological crisis, which is really facing our planet today. So here we have a new spirituality and new ethics. The new spirituality, as we will see in a moment, is this is the first document ever to talk about biodiversity. I mean, when you think of it, it's mind-boggling for a church that claims to be pro-life, that we have nothing to say about the 10 million other species on which we depend and are as close to us. Orangutans, we share 98.4 common DNA with them, so it's not as if they're living on another planet. And what they're basically saying is they have intrinsic value. They're at the end of their evolutionary journey as we are on ours as Homo sapiens. They are calling to us for a claim. The birds, the insects, and the wonder of how they actually create the world on which we live, and the trees. So one of the things that becoming part of trying to understand this will be creating the context where a new spirituality will take seriously our real understanding and our appreciation of all of God's creations. Not just from the head of learning botany or biology, but from the experience of being part of creation. So, for 2,000 years we have focused on human relations with God and with other human beings. Christians knew it was wrong to worship false gods. We have to read the Hebrew scripture, to kill, to steal, commit adultery, you name it, to lie. But the majority of Christians did not think it was wrong to devastate the forests or drain the marshes. That's what you do with marshes, you drain them. We call them swamps. What do you do with swamps? Clean them out. They don't smell very well for a start. You don't like them. And they're very serious ecosystems on our planet today. Let's be honest, those who ploughed up the prairies of North America in the 19th century, who cut down the forests in Ireland in the 7th and the 12th century, who mined for gold by using mercury or cyanide, who in my years in the Philippines cut down the tropical rain, they did not think these were morally wrong actions. They may have thought aspects were morally wrong. They weren't paying the workers, for example, in the Philippines a decent wage, but just taking down the forests. Now we actually know these are. But the point I want to make, if we want this, we're asking for a profound, long-lasting influence on Catholic social teaching. We need a systematic, extensive moral catechesis aimed at bringing about the serious changes which are envisaged in this particular topic. So if we don't even see the serious changes, we won't see the necessity of this extraordinary change. So he talks about St. Francis and why he, as a Jesuit, interesting, he found him an attractive and compelling character as a guide and inspiration for him, Bishop of Rome, which is 3 years ago, this next week, isn't it? The 13th of March. And I think it's four extraordinary reasons. His concern for the poor, and that was central to St. Francis' way of living. His concern for creation. Now, he didn't understand evolution. He thought every creature was created by God, but he had this extraordinary, not understood at that time, way of looking at nature. His commitment to society and to challenging what the brothers brought to the church at the time. But finally, this is the way of contemplation. This is the way of mysticism into the future, of being aware of that every creature God has created for us has something specific to tell us about the reality of the divine. And that's included in this encyclical with a beautiful quotation from St. Thomas of Aquin. So then we say, well, why hasn't this all happened? And because the way we had presented the faith, particularly the second millennium, had an anti-body and an anti-creature, and particularly anti-women's body. I just go and read Augustine on that, but particularly go and read Jerome. And Jerome was actually bankrolled in Palestine as he was translating the text by a group of women, some of them in Rome. Some of them had lost their husbands. They should have been much more critical of what he was at. So we might like to think that St. Francis, his wonderful fraternal relationship with creation, continued and blossomed in the centuries after his death. Sorry, it didn't. There's no historical evidence. It didn't happen. Francis' vision was lost, even among Franciscans. Or if it wasn't, please show me where in the 15th century, Pietas Moderna was centered on a mysticism of our understanding of God's presence in other creatures. It wasn't. And there were very clear reasons for this. The dualism that we inherited from the Greek world, and particularly was put in place during the extraordinary, powerful focus and force that Augustine in the 5th century had on all the Christian churches. I mean, Augustine is by far the most powerful theologian since St. Paul. And the dualism was part of that. It was part of the Hellenistic world. So you had spirit and matter. And spirit was closer to the divine, and actually matter didn't matter. One of our own poets in Ireland, he wrote a wonderful poem in the 19th, things fall apart. That's what happens to matter. Matter falls apart. So it doesn't have anything of the divinity. Your own theologian here, Elizabeth Johnson, has written a beautiful book on this, God's Charity is Broad Enough for the Bears. I heard her last year in Dublin, or in Maynooth in Ireland, talking about this. We also had this wonder of, yes, when we talked, for example, today's reading of chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel, the gratuitous love of the Father. I mean, the first thing you have to remember about today's reading is this. Everyone who heard it was shocked. Absolutely shocked. No man ever spoke like that. Men didn't do that. In actual fact, the Father had the right to have his Son killed. He wanted his inheritance before he died. So that's what everyone believed. Every person there, male and female, who heard that this is not how fathers act. So we wanted to retain that and focus on the supernatural, and rightly so. But at the same time, we lost God's presence on the merely natural. And we've never seen it until very recently as central to our understanding of creation. So, primarily what happened was creation no longer was seen as a gift. It was just seen as the background on which humans worked out their lives on this stage. Now, the most extraordinary statement of Christianity and every religion that believes in God is actually life. I have life. The extraordinary miracle of life. And everything around me has life. And if I can't start with awe and reverence by what the sciences are telling us about how life emerged, but also gratitude for this extraordinary gift, I haven't even begun to think of God's presence in creation. So that's the first thing that has to change. The natural world is not a stage. The natural world is a reality which all of us are acting on today and changing. The second thing was an extraordinary traumatic event, which has got very little attention in the second millennium, but was the single most powerful and destructive reality that happened in Europe in the second millennium. It was the Black Death. From 1346 until 1553. The last place where there are records is the town of Kilkenny. It was the city of Kilkenny. It's about 45 miles south of London, or south of Dublin, where something like 4,000 people died. In Dublin itself, something like 16,000 people. It was a very small country. Right up from Drogheda, the whole Franciscan friary died. That's what happened with the Black Death. Between 75 and 200 million people, and closer to 200 were lost in 5 years. We have from, for example, places like Florence, in a period of 4 months, 70% of the population wiped out. It was extraordinary. It was so quick, You were well today, within a week you were dead, and with awful kinds of pain and suffering. So vast amounts of people were affected. How do you deal with it? That was the religious question. And this is what happened. It brought about these extraordinary changes that had a profound effect on European history. During the Black Death, the clergy were often very good. That's why so many of the good ones died. But after the Black Death, as what happened in the Irish famine, when you start looking at the statements of bishops in the 1850s, things changed. They begin to say, why did God do this? We always have to have an answer for that. And fundamentally, God did it. He was punishing this generation. And then some bright people began to say, oh, was this generation worse than the previous generation? Well, maybe, but maybe not. So why was he punishing us? And the other side of it, if you want to deal with it, it's a spirituality. Prayer, asceticism, mortification, and withdrawal from engagement in the world. That was the effect of the Black Death. And it lasted right until Vatican II. So creation had no value. This wonder that the primary revelation of God to us and all creatures for 4.8 billion years had nothing to say to us, which is just amazing. And of course, it worked out into the Reformation itself, where human degradation became so central, and the merits of Christ in bringing about redemption was so overwhelming that the natural world was completely lost. We kept saying that we were interested in nature, against the Lutheran reality of the 16th century. We had it in the Council of Trent. But we also took it on board. I was ordained 47 years ago this Easter Sunday. We still had a Mass in Latin, and this is what we prayed after communion. Oremus, let us pray. Domine, docias nos terrena despicere, et amarige. Teach us to despise the things of earth, terrena, earthly things. Et amare, and to love the things of heaven. Well, that gives you clearly what we thought. If we're to despise the things of heaven or things of earth, they have no value for us. And that's exactly. And that was the famous from the fathers. The lex orandi, the way we pray, is the way we live and believe and what we do. That has to change dramatically. But even in the last translation, we were told to judge wisely the things of earth and to love the things of heaven. Now, one of the things we've got to get straight into our minds, we are earthlings. We are not, this is our home. Our true home is on earth. Our belief in what happened to the life of Jesus, his passion, death, and resurrection, that's the promise of the future. We don't know the physics of it. We know Jesus went through walls. We don't know the chemistry of it. We know it as God's promise and we believe it. But we are earthlings. And you talk to the man, was it Kelly, who was one year up in space. They recently came down to Earth. He talks about he gained 2 inches in the sky. He talks about its impact on his bones. So we're earthlings, and we need. And again, we had the Jansenism. Again, it was condemned, but it worked its way into Irish Christianity. 4 of the first teachers in the news in 1795 were Jansenists from the Sorbonne in France. And so we brought that with us. Human depravity, original sin, confession, all of those. Did we bring, what about the wonder of, for example, the Burn, where you look at the Lower Carboniferous, where in the May morning you walk out and you see the spring gentians, and they're out there for 4 and 5 miles right out into the sea, and you're enthralled by God's beauty. Sure, you know, there are dangers and difficulties in this. But this is the wonder of God's creation as well. Like in the Rosary, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Well, there's more to the world than just mourning and weeping. There's the absolute beauty of the world, of the birds of the air. Now we know, unfortunately, there are 9,000 species of birds, but 3,000 of them are on the red list at the moment, facing extinction. So that was the kind of spirituality that was in religious houses right up to Vatican II. Spirituality a priority to salvation of one's souls, one's future life in heaven, and very little involvement in the affairs of the world. To such an extent that Pope John Paul II, the same also said, in matter of just laity must not suppose they would be acting prudently to lessen their Christian commitment to this passing world. So he was aware we were holding back from the world. And he says, he goes on and says, on the contrary, we insist they must intensify it, increase it continually. Let no one suppose that a life of activity in the world is incompatible with spiritual perfection. So that's the kind of world he challenges us to come out of. Now, not everyone. There were some things. And one that Pope Francis quotes actually in Laudato Si is St. John of the Cross, where he begins to use the metaphors of creation. The mountains have heights. They are plentiful, vast and beautiful, graceful, bright and fragrant. These mountains are what my beloved was to me. But the reality is, so he's in a sense one of the only ones. But all of these priests were all reading the Psalms every day. And 1/3 of the Psalms are about the beauty of God's creation. So how they were reading in Latin, Psalm 104, for example, about the beauty of creation, and not bringing that into their spirituality of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. That's the challenge we have to face. So, but these voices were exceptions. Here's a person I have great time for. I've read her books right through my priestly life, but listen to what Teresa of Avila has to say. The creatures are only crumbs that fall from God's table, and none but dogs will turn to pick them up. Now, we can't take that spiritual on board. I mean, that was her time, that was her culture, but today we have to have something quite different. We cannot have a jaundiced approach to the natural world, and Pope Francis acknowledges this. It's a mistake understanding of our principle that at times has led us to justify mistreating nature, to exercise tyranny over creation, he uses that word, to engage in war, injustice, and acts of violence. So how could Catholic cultures like Spain, for example, have bullfighting? What does it say about our understanding of a bull? It just is totally inimical. We believers should acknowledge that in doing so, we were not faithful to the treasury of wisdom which has been called to protect and preserve, number 200. So, he comes to creation, the book of creation, particularly chapter 1. So, he talks about, now, the beginning, chapter 1 of creation is extraordinary because it tells us that the world was created, the universe was created by a loving and personal God. Now, many cultures in the Middle East at the time did not believe that. Many believed that there were equally powerful cultures, or spirits. There was a spirit of good and an equally powerful spirit of evil. The Jews couldn't believe that because their experience of God was quite different. So that's why they wrote, right, when they took the Gilgamesh epic, but they said it was good. Genesis chapter 1, 10, 13, 18, 21, 26. You've got to get it, it's good. And then when it came in 31 to talk about the creation of humans, it's very good. But then we go on to say, let us make in likeness of ourselves, and let them be masters of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and conquer. So this is where we begin to get into a bit of trouble. How do we understand this conquer? To fill the earth and conquer, because it has had a profound impact on the way Jews and Christians have viewed the natural world. This is what we do. We don't just kill one or two. We just go out and slaughter and slaughter. And don't think it's immoral, because we have a right to subdue the earth. Pope Francis is aware that the Genesis account grants man dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as domineering and destructive by nature. And now he does something that popes don't always do. He says this is an incorrect understanding of Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Now, of course, if he goes back and reads Progressio Populorum, that's the way it was understood in Progressio Populorum. He goes on then to connect it with the second account of creation, which is very different. The first one is cosmological. You can see them going into the temple and singing and praising this. The second was the potter from the earth. So it was to till and to keep, Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Keeping, the Hebrew word means caring, protecting, and overseeing. So for Pope Francis, the text calls humans to be thoughtful and careful in the way where they can create. But he does admit that it is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the Scripture. Nowadays we must forcibly reject the notion about being created in God's image gives us dominion over the earth, which justifies absolute dominance over other creatures, what we did to the oceans. World War II ended on land in 1945. We have been fighting it in the oceans. Just look at what we're doing there with ships, taking literally tens of tons of fish out of, just every day, out of the oceans. The dominion given in Genesis is in fact to human to imitate God's loving kindness and faithfulness, and to act as his leader or viceroy in relationship to a non-human component. Now we haven't taken that seriously. So Exodus reminds us that the first account, it didn't end in chapter 1, or chapter 131. It ended actually in chapter 2, verse 4a. It ended with the greatest institution of the Jewish world. And actually, it's the reason why you people are here today. It was the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was meant for humans and for other creatures. If you were in Babylon, because the Sabbath came out of their experience of degradation in Babylon, they had been brought, they had lost their kings, they had lost their temple, they had lost their land, their king had his eyes gouged out. If you were a betting man and you were down in Babylon and you were asked to say, who will survive this? The Jews or the Babylonians? You would have put your car, you would have put your house, whatever else you had, on Babylonians. They didn't. Why did the Jews survive it? A very one simple reason. They had a coherent story that gives sense and purpose to their living. And that's why they had the Sabbath. They repeated God's love for them through down in Egypt, etc. That's what we do with Sunday right now. So what we've got to get on this level is a new coherent story that includes our love for God, our love for other human beings, and our love for creation. So the highlight is, and here we have to go back to the Jubilee. The Jubilee was a process of redistribution of wealth. To go back to the Davos thing, if we don't have a process of redistribution, the very small minority will get superiorly wealthy. We need to stop that. But we need to look at one thing. How was Genesis interpreted historically? Not how we'd like it to be interpreted, but how, and we say from the Tudor period onward, it was experienced as control, complete control over nature. And here I'm reading from a historian. The world has been created for man's sake, and other species were meant to be subordinate to his wishes and needs. So that's how it was interpreted, right from the Tudor period of the 17th century. Those theologians and intellectuals who felt the need to justify could readily appeal to classical philosophers and the Bible. So they had two sources. They had Aristotle and Plato on their side, and they thought they had the Bible. Nature made nothing in vain, said Aristotle, who was both a biologist and a philosopher, and everything had a purpose. Plants were created for the sake of animals, animals for the sake of man, domestic animals were there to labour, wild ones were to be hunted. And it comes to the Stoics. Nature existed solely to serve man's interest. That's the real problem. That's from Keith Thomas. He was a historian of the natural world. He taught in Oxford, and that's his book from 1983. That's how it was interpreted. We might like it, and now we have to move away from that. So now we have the tragedy that the human-centered, this dualistic approach to nature, particularly after the scientific revolution, with the beginning of the industrial revolution, with James Watt, we are beginning to do enormous realities to the planet. We have unlatched processes which have begun to alter the physical makeup of the planet. So we're just, Laudato Si, when it was published, people said, what does it say on climate change? And many people said, this is a climate change encyclical. Well, climate change is there, but there's much more, as we will see, than climate change. What does Pope Francis said? Now, in the 10 years before that, the Vatican had run a seminar, for example, in 2007, brought 4 people from this country who denied climate change. So people were wondering, would he have a caveat? Would he say maybe? he doesn't. He says, a very solid scientific consensus indicates we're presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climate system. Full stop. No ifs, no buts. Now, he's based here on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are 3,000 scientists. I know about 10 of them from Irish and English background. Some of them are marine biologists, 2 of them are biologists, one is a chemist. These people, most of them work in universities or work for governments. You won't get 3,000 scientists to agree with anything unless they're basically lowest common denominator. The 2013, which was the fifth IPCC report, basically said they're 95% sure it's happening and they're 90% sure that humans are doing it. You can't do better than that. So, humans are mainly responsible. But he also goes on to say, who will suffer from climate change? The poor. For example, even with an increased level of the oceans, even if it's just 1 metre in the next 100 years, there's 15 to 20 million people in Bangladesh alone living just 1 metre above the high water mark because their farms are replenished with soils coming down from the Himalayas each year with the monsoons. What's going to happen if the oceans rise 1 metre? Where are they going to go? To Europe? To North America? That's the kind of questions we're going to be facing. So he makes it clear, he accepts the scientific consensus that humans are generating climate change. Here's one. My friend is a Filipina sister whom I've been working with for years, so I just read this. He says, sorry, Your Holiness, but I'm not a believer. There's hope for everyone, my son. Then he goes, oh, I'm talking about climate change. Then again, maybe not. So, it talks about much more than climate change. Poverty, destruction of biodiversity, pollutant of water of the oceans, sustainable food, the extractive industries, and waste in our economy. So if you're going to get involved in this, there's plenty of issues to get involved with. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about, the extraordinary extinction of species. Life began about 3.8 billion years ago. It began in the oceans. And it lived in the oceans very peacefully for 3 billion years before the Cambrian period, when it came onto land. So, Pope says, the Earth's resources are being plundered. Now that's fairly strong language, not they're being used, by short-sighted approaches to economy, commerce and production. This is what happened. The last great extinction happened 65 billion years ago at the end of the Cretaceous period. That's the geological period, at the end of what's called the Middle Life, the Mesozoic period. What happened? We now know that about a 10-kilometer asteroid struck what is now Yucatan. At that stage, Yucatan wasn't in the place it is today, because the Americas, for example, only were connected 5 billion years ago. Yucatan was much further south of plate tectonics. So, what happened? Photosynthesis was blocked out, the sun was blocked out, and creatures that depended on these on nature, particularly plant life, became extinct. But at the moment, the 6th largest, we are causing the extinction of 100,000 species each year. And we're not even aware of it. This is the tree of life. We're all part of this. We have evolved with them, and we don't even ring the bells on Holy Souls Day. That something extraordinary is gone and will never, ever again be seen by anyone on planet Earth. The extinction rate is between now 100 and 1,000 times higher than it was until very recently. That's what's happening around us. And here's one of your biologists from this town, Edward Wilson. He's actually brought out a new book that's out there on the New York Times last week. He says, the quenching of life's exuberance will be more consequential to humanity than all present-day warming, ozone depletion, and pollutant combined. That's pretty challenging. So one of the things I'm suggesting, and this is my last point, a 3-year synod. Now, I'm not saying synod of bishops, I'm saying synod of the churches. That you would start here, for example. The first year would be in your parishes and in the Archdiocese of Boston. The first year you would come to know your local environment. What are the resources that are here? The trees? What are the birds that are here? What are the grasses? What are the flowers? To come to understand them and know them as part of your reality. So in other words, to get to know the ecosystems and how they're being impacted by the recent developments of the last 50 years. You would also then, obviously, you would be depending on people who know these kind of things. People who teach biology, for example, in your high school, know all of this. And there are people who bring you on walks around the city who know the names. I mean, as I walked around even Boston College, the names of the trees aren't there. I mean, if I brought you around where I live in Ireland, we have the name of oak trees. And we're telling you oak trees support about 350 other species, from birds to insects. So if you want to talk about community, the best image of community in where I live is actually the oak tree. And that would be true here too. So, important to have young people particularly, because this is the world they're going to inherit. Whether they're going to synagogue, mosque or church, this is the world they're going to live. So, also then the questions of Laudato Si, like greenhouse gases. For example, the way we eat meat. Columbia, from the University of Columbia, about 10 years ago, said, if everyone in the world uses meat like Europeans and the North Americans, we could feed 2 billion people. We're going to have 10 billion people by the end of this century. How are we going to feed them? Now, is this the only way? Is this the only way of food? Most of our generation that came from Ireland 400 or 500 years ago had nothing like the meat we eat. In the Philippines, all the years I was there, we had nothing like that. So we're going to have to change that, but the way he talks about changing it is through dialogue with our farming community, with alternatives, but also with supports with those who run the structures of society in terms of economics and politics. And that they don't help the big companies, they actually help, and he's very big on that, in Laudato Si, to help small farmers. And then the use of energy, use of water. Water will be huge in this world, in the world we're going into. It's already, I mean, you have lots of examples here and in Europe of groundwater being toxified by chemicals. Our waste, is our waste sustainable? But also we need to develop prayers and a spirituality to make it easier for local groups to honour their relationship with God, human beings, and the natural world. Appropriate liturgies will be important to celebrate this for a more harmonious way of living on the natural world. Then the second year would be the synod at the national level, the country here, which would bring in the oceans. We're very poor on the oceans as Christians and as Jews. There's only one book in the Bible that talks about the oceans, and it was a bad book. Jonas was the person who bought it. We know where he ended up, and we don't want to go there. It would be a huge boost to ecological thinking and action around the world, and the Catholic Church could play a catalyst. This would not be a Catholic thing, because he talks about everyone is involved in this. It would be ecumenical and interreligious. As I said to you at the beginning, this is a document about evangelization. And just 3 quotes to end. Every creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Number 77. Extraordinary. Christians in turn realize that their responsibilities in creation and their duty towards the Creator are an essential part of their faith. That's actually from Pope John Paul II, 1990 document. And then finally, 2. Human life is grounded in 3 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with the neighbour, and with the earth itself. Thank you.
So I'd really like to thank Father Sean for giving us lots of new insights. Did you ever guess that some of these issues that happened back in, hundreds of years ago impact the way we think today? But it really does. So I want to mention a couple of things. We're going to have some questions from Father Sean, but some of the things that he mentioned in terms of this church synod are things that we're trying to do here at Sacred Heart and St. Bridget. So we're recruiting for other members of our Faith and Environment team. We're hoping to plan a quote green liturgy right around Earth Day on April 24th. So we invite people to help with that. But also there are some issues that are coming up recently in Massachusetts that you can help on as well. Last year we had an effort to put solar panels on roofs in Lexington, and it was very successful. And now, in their wisdom, the state legislature is dragging their feet on that, especially in the House of Representatives. So I'll pass around these little green sheets that will tell you some more about what you can do. The other issue is natural gas pipelines. You can read all about it here. So I'd like to ask who has questions for Parmesan. Okay, Ed? If you can't come up, if you can't, Parmesan will repeat the question.
It's implied, but is climate denial considered a sin? And if so, is it an excommunicatable offense?
Did you all hear that? I'm just a simple priest. So what does excommunication mean? I never heard of it. No, it is a sin. No, that's what Patriarch Cullen says. It's our being totally unaware of what we're doing and leaving a world to our great-grandchildren or our grand-nephews and nieces that would be very difficult to live in. And if that's not what sin is, I don't know what sin is. I mean, the science is so clear. We now know, for example, between the end of the Ice Age, 11,000 years ago, and James Watt of 1750, there were 280 parts per billion of carbon in the atmosphere. It was steady. Now, interesting, and it led to steady climates across the world, which allowed for the development of agriculture. Now, what happened with the Industrial Revolution, we began to put fossil carbon from the lower Carboniferous and the Cretaceous, when we got to oil, back up into the atmosphere. It's now 405 parts per million, and all you have to do is to get carbon and go into your laboratory and heat it, and see that, unlike oxygen, it retains heat and re-radiates heat. So that's why now our temperature is 1 degree Celsius above what it was in the pre-industrial era. But the carbon we have put in the atmosphere already, and the commitments we made to Paris, would mean that by 2050, it would be 3.8 degrees Celsius above 1750, which would bring about a new geological era called the Anthropocene, which has already been talked about. It's in a Vatican document, 2012, what's happening to the glaciers. So, this particular process would be geological, and you wouldn't be turning back on it. For example, 4 degrees Celsius rise would turn the Amazon into a savanna in 150 years. So if we go back in geological time, the lower Carboniferous is 20 million years old. The Cretaceous period is almost 60 million years old. And that we as humans created a geological era in 250 years. These are the issues. And that's why they're moral issues. Pope John Paul said there were moral issues, and they are moral issues. But the other side of it, if we deal with carbon, we could have a much better way of living, and much closer to each other, and much closer to the natural world. So what we tend to say is, oh, you're saying these awful things. But there are very good things possible if we actually make these changes. Like you're talking, for example, about photovoltaic. If you had asked me 10 years ago, and if I could have been here, is photovoltaic a runner? I'd have said no, because it's so expensive. It has gone down by 80% in the 10 years. But it does need governments, local, state and national, to support the kind. We're giving literally billions to the fossil fuel industry. We don't look at it like that, but that's what we're actually doing. Why can't we give it to ones we actually know that are going to make a difference into the future? So, but as for excommunication, I was so close to it myself so many times that I don't even want to go there. I was actually, that's
Do you see at least 1 or 2 hopeful signs coming out of the conference in Paris?
I see, do I see hopeful signs coming? Hopeful signs. I see huge hopeful signs. I've been at almost every COP since 1992, the one down in Rio. So I've been at, so what happened in Paris that was extraordinary? First of all, 157 countries signed up for this. They signed up, they gave in their own assessment what their commitments would be. So they weren't being forced to do it by other countries. Okay? they actually did also say, we will put a 5-year return to these commitments. They're not sufficient, but they're the beginning of something. They talked about the Green Fund of having $200 billion a year. Now we know, well, what's going to happen to the 20 million people living in Bangladesh when the ocean does rise. The people I read on the ocean are talking about at least 1.5 meters because of what's happening in Greenland and what's happening on the Western Antarctic. And you begin to, I only began to see this, for example, the previous year I was down in Lima. Lima is there's nothing happening there. There's everything happening there. For example, if you go 4 degrees above, the tropical forest is gone. Lima is a city of 9 million people. It's in a desert. It depends on rivers coming from the glaciers. I went up last time with a Colombian and a geologist. We went up where the glaciers were in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and where they're going. Now, what do you do with that? So, when I say to you $200 billion, you say, oh, that's huge. But that's the kind of money we're going to be talking about. But that's our future. And we've got to begin. So, I thought Paris, there were limitations to it. But it was the first time ever. Now, your government here has used the EPA to begin to bring some level of control on your utilities. Hopefully your Supreme Court doesn't actually interfere with this. Because actually you would be the only country in the world. I mean, I was around, when there were 20 and 30 countries wondering about climate change in Bali, for example, back 8 or 10 years ago. That's all gone. I mean, the only groups that I hear now, and even I don't hear them talking about it, but there is the Republican Party here. And that's just not on.
I keep getting phone calls from solar energy companies, and they say, we would be glad to put an array on your roof. But I tell them, then do a survey, and they find out I've got this big maple tree in the backyard, and they say, no, it's not going to work on your property. So you just turned that into a moral dilemma for me, sir. What do I do? How do I deal with that?
Do you know how we deal with it? Talk to your neighbours and talk to yourself. I mean, I'm not going to come at any level of saying, I know, the maple tree are using photovoltaic, but I'm just saying to you, these are the ways. I mean, a lot of things are happening here. I was just writing an article last night. I mean, some of the best levels of technological change are actually happening in this country, particularly with the capacity, with battery capacity to retain energy. And that will be huge in places like I work in the Philippines. Because what it will begin to mean is you will not be dependent on the major lines. And I give it to you in terms of my own thing with phones. When I went back to Lake Cebu after my father died, I said to my mother I would call her once a month, which meant me leaving Lake Cebu, getting a bus of 10 hours over to Davao City, staying with the Mary Potters, going down at 11:45 at night, because that would be 8 hours earlier in the Philippines, in Ireland, and giving her a call. And actually the phone line could collapse in about 2 minutes. Now with phone technology, I certainly text Lake Cebu once a week. I actually talk on Skype to them now. So there's huge potential change in the whole way energy has been and will be delivered into the future. And most of it should be on the side of actually renewables and not on the side of petrochemicals. So that's the general thing I would say to you. But don't have a dilemma. The one thing we have to be very careful in the Catholic Church, because we dished it out in huge amounts, is guilt. Guilt does nothing for us. As you can see in today's gospel, if the Father had said to your man, you know what you did, and will you at least admit it? That's the way we actually did moral stuff. Admit your guilt. Well, that's not what Luke chapter 15. And you see, one of the things I said, if you were doing a synod here, in other words, a synod is sharing about how you do these things. And I know across this country, there are in every town and city people who are actually helping people in cities to become reacquainted with the natural world and with these kind of dilemmas that you're talking about. So that's what a synod would make available to you. It wouldn't be just me Googling. It would be this community sharing its experience and actually also sharing costs. Like what I'm trying to do in my hometown with photovoltaic is to get our street, not just me, to get our street to go into it and actually obviously get a better value, a better deal for everyone because we're going into it as a community. That's the kind of thing that a community engagement with this would bring about. But no guilt, please. We don't do guilt. We've done enough guilt in the Catholic Church to do us for about 100,000 years. So thank you very much, you guys.